I'm so sorry. But we can't untie for nothing. We can't. Maybe what happened could change everything. Everyone.
What are you talking about?
We have to find a way to forgive them.
He butchered our son.
I know.
You're insane.
Listen to me.
You're insane.
Listen to me. We are so sorry. We are truly sorry. Please, have faith in me. Please. We need to forgive them. We need to forgive them. Please. We have to.
That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
There's nothing to fear except God. Whatever that means to you.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
You're listening to The Fear of God, a podcast exploring the intersection between Christianity and the horror genre.
Hello and welcome to another 2018 episode of The Fear of God, your favorite podcast, and ours too. With you as always is your favorite host, Nathan Rouse. My favorite host, Reed Lackey, is usually with me, but he had to go check on this weird plant bulb bloody thing in the toilet that he said kept sort of sprouting. I don't know what on earth he was talking. It sounds vile, to be frank with you, but this is The Fear of God, where we talk about all things horrific, and certainly that fits the bill. Reed! Happy 2018! What the listeners don't know, the readers and the listeners, because our listeners are readers, don't know is that while, we've wished them a Happy New Year on Rear Window and It Comes at Night, it is only now officially the new year for you and I.
That's right.
Because we are time travelers.
We've caught up.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
That wrinkle in time has finally ironed itself out.
I love that book.
That movie looks spectacular.
Yeah, I'm very excited for it.
I want to be a warrior.
I hope that movie does justice to that beloved, beautiful book.
So you've read that? I've not read it.
Yeah. Oh, you should. You would love it.
It would surprise me if it doesn't, not because I know the book, but because I respect Ava a bunch and think she's going to bring some good sensibilities to it.
Sure. Oh, yeah. I'm very excited for that movie.
So, yes.
So
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you recovered from your soiree?
From my soiree?
From
my trip to the bathroom.
Your New Year's
soiree.
I don't know.
I don't know what you were
Sometimes
talking about.
I have to recover from my trips to the bathroom.
This bulb thing that I've got going, I don't know.
That was a reference to the movie.
I know it's a reference to the movie. Okay. I'm trying to figure out. It's early for me. It's early for see what listeners also
and readers
don't know is that you listened to a whole section of podcasts in which Nathan was in California, and so we were in the same room there. Now it's my turn to feel the jet lag. It's my turn to feel the time displacement because I'm in North Carolina, which is my old stomping grounds, but it's 3 hours later. So right now my body is telling me, hey, it's only barely 7:30, and instead I should,
And I'm so used to you being in a little box on my computer screen, I don't know what to do when you're like, yes, please. You're too close right now, Reed. back up, okay?
Leave it.
So it's a new year. We're doing this series. We haven't officially called it anything. I'm gonna perhaps officially refer to it as #Rear Window, okay?
Okay.
Because we are taking a look back at some horror movies of 2017.
Yes.
Contextualizing them in this brave new world of 3 days into 2018 already.
Exactly.
So 2 weeks ago, we began also a new series for the year, much like our Universal Monsters of 17 are hashtag Alfred Letters.
Oh, let's go ahead and keep that one.
Alfred,
Yeah, or
from Melmac. Either
that
one.
one's harder to say. So
It
let's
is.
just
It
say
is.
Alfred
But that's
letters.
why that's kind of fun.
Yes. We have different definitions of fun. Wouldn't it be fun if we just sat around and tried to pronounce ridiculous things?
So we began Alfred Letters with Rear Window 2 weeks ago. We began hashtag Rear Window, maybe 3 or 4 episode series last week with It Comes at Night. Mm-hmm. And we continue that series with the much beloved audience favorite Darren Aronofsky picture, Mother!
Wow.
Not to be confused with Mother.
Yeah, because you need that emphasis.
You do.
Yes.
You do.
It's a very
I
deliberate.
couldn't decide if you go
point.
up on the second syllable or if it's just a
Oh, you
whole
mean
syllable.
like a mother?
Yes. And I'm glad we're able to invoke some levity right now because it's all downhill from here.
Yeah, once we get into the actual film, levity's probably going to go right out the window.
So as we before we get to that though,
Okay.
Mother,
Mother, mommy.
that's actually what it should have been titled. Yes, mommy. With someone, the picture art, box art being someone in the corner sucking their thumb. Before we get there though, would you like to begin us into our official 2018 first edition of?
Yeah. What you watching? What you reading? What you listening to?
Wow. Reed has been traipsing around his old Church of God stomping grounds on his New Year's trip to North Carolina, and it is clear the Gaithers have gotten back in his blood. And I would like to point out to readers and listeners that, you know, a couple months ago, Reed threw some serious shade at me during my What You Watching for my physicality that I did during the song, like closing my eyes and getting in a meditative yoga-like
Holding
posture.
your goblets.
Well, Reed just totally surfed through his version, at least the first half, having his hands out to the side, palms down, surfing while singing.
I even stood on the chair. I was like trying to balance.
Yeah, I was impressed you did that with so little noise.
Oh,
So it's 2018, Reed.
yes.
What you watching, reading, listening to, Brother Gaither?
Well, the thing is, so I'm going to make a preemptive What You Watching, Reading, Listening to, just because I'm very excited that the episodes have just dropped. I think we've talked about it on the show before. I can't remember if I've ever actually used it in a What You Watching, Reading, Listening to, but season 4, another 6 episodes of Black Mirror have dropped on Netflix.
Whenever you say that title, does your brain subconsciously sing the Arcade Fire song? Mine does.
Oh, interesting. No,
Now it will.
It probably will
Yep,
now.
yep.
Yes, that's probably going to happen. Yeah, but I love that show. That show is, and we perhaps imminently will, sort of
Today, maybe.
Maybe
We may just pivot away.
Let's just abandon.
We'll
keep the
need
title
to.
of the episode, but we're not going to.
Surprise!
But yeah, Black Mirror I think is a very.
Black Mirror.
It's a fascinating series because it really asks a lot of pertinent questions to what technology has done to humanity and how we engage with our devices, our electronics, and how in frightening and enlightening ways our technology is changing us, is causing us to shift our priorities, shift our interactions. And so I love all 3 prior seasons. It was not originally a Netflix original series.
Right, it was
started
BBC.
Started as first 2 seasons are BBC. There's 6 episodes total for seasons 1 and 2. And then season 3 has 6 new episodes that Netflix commissioned. Season 4 is the same category, 6 new episodes that Netflix commissioned. And they're about an hour long, but what's cool is because one thing that I do love about the Netflix model, you and I go back and forth on the pros and cons, but one thing I love about it is the flexibility of time, because like the first episode in the new season is like an hour and 15 minutes or so. And then there's an episode, like I think it's episode 5 or something, it's only 40 minutes. So it's basically...
Well, and that's something that works really well for something so strictly anthology.
Sure, yeah. Just the amount of time you need to tell your story. do that,
Right.
and then that's what I really appreciate about just Netflix in general, is that just, okay, whatever allotment you need to get your story told, do that. And so at this point I have, this January 3rd, I was debating whether or not I actually wanted to say the date, but so we're recording on January 3rd. I have not yet seen any of season 4, but
They all die.
oh,
Yep.
well,
Every episode.
that frequently happens. No, but so I'm very excited to, again, a preemptive. By the time listeners hear this, I will have plowed through season 4, but I'm very eager and excited to do that as it.
What I find funny about your strident affection for Black Mirror is, I don't know if you recall this, I tipped you off to its existence
Yes.
a couple years ago.
Absolutely.
I've only seen 2 episodes, and
I
you've now
know.
seen like all of it.
Which is
I know, well, I like it. I respect it. I want to go back to
On
it.
2
It's
episodes,
just, I know.
you haven't even seen it.
I know.
I'm like, well, that's the thing. Like, not to be like rude to you or anything, but I was
Oh, no, please, go ahead.
I was so surprised
Pummel me.
when you were
Verbally.
like, oh, you gotta see Black Mirror. Like, it's
I just
so
knew
great.
you would like it.
I know.
It's Twilight Zone-esque. I know you love Twilight Zone.
Oh my gosh, because 2 of my favorite episodes of the show, and there's another one that I wasn't as fond of, but that most of the rest of the world is very affectionate toward. They're all in season 3. So like season 3 is like where the show really hits its nexus. The first 2 seasons are very strong and very good.
Sure.
But season 3, much of it just sort of went into the stratosphere. So you definitely got to get on that. It's a really good show.
I'll do that. I'll take a look in the Black Mirror after I finish talking about Mother. Mommy, help me. So as far as my what you watching, reading, listening to, did you have anything else you want to?
No. I just wanted to mention that.
So one movie, one book, one not so serious, one mildly serious. I did go see The Shape of Water. Guillermo del Toro.
What is its shape?
It's rather phallic, if I'm being honest.
Wow.
I was going to say it's also, you could call it E.T. for adults, or it
Close
is.
Encounters of another kind.
Wow! Yes, very close encounters. Yes.
We're gonna
So
stop
many.
there.
Yeah. I gotta
We're gonna
stop.
stop
I gotta stop because we could be there all day, just swimming around. So, The Shape of Water, I did enjoy it. I think Sally Hawkins will definitely get nominated, possibly win. I mean, she's fantastic in it. Richard Jenkins is great in it. Has a wonderful supporting role. It's just for genre lovers like us. I mean, even in the first 10 minutes, I was like, wow, I really love this conceit, which is we're so used to these days the big blockbuster world exploding kind of thing.
Right.
It kind of takes that approach if the janitors were the ones observing the world exploding kind of thing. It's like the big stuff is happening. They're kind of on the periphery of the story. And so I found that a very enjoyable, sort of perspective on it. And in keeping with our universal horror sort of through line here, it is kind of a spiritual cousin to The Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Oh, okay, fascinating.
So he goes around smacking things, saying, F
Smacking
this,
people, yes.
F that, F you.
F this lamp. F this guy.
There is some effing that goes on.
Wow. I've seen the movie poster. I figured that was an element. Oh. It is early, and we have to.
Yep.
We have to fit in.
Get our
as
sillies
much,
out.
Well, yeah, we've got to fit in as much levity.
Mother
as
is
we
on
can.
her way.
Oh,
She
man.
is not happy. So yes, did see The Shape of Water, but also have just started reading a book that you actually gave to me for Christmas. So thank you for that. And want to recommend, even though I'm only a few chapters in, it's by a gentleman named David Gushee, Gushee. And I don't know, I found this post our Rear Window conversation. I found this interesting. In Rear Window, I talked during my mini, or not even mini, just major rant in line with The Last Jedi. I talked about semantics and Christian and fan and that sort of thing. So interestingly, the title of this book is actually still Christian. The subtitle is the scandalous part, though, Following Jesus Out of American Evangelicalism. So I'm really excited to jump into that. Perhaps I won't be so quick to abandon the word once I'm done. Still Christian by David Gushee. So yeah, that's my what you're watching, what you're reading. You wanna take us home, Mark Lowry?
What you watching? What you reading?
Amen.
What you listening to? Can I tell you a quick story?
Please.
And it will be very brief. So it's interesting.
It better be.
No. Well, it was funny, just an observation. This would not categorize in any sort of regular thing we do on our show.
Sure.
So it's just a side anecdote. So you referenced sort of in passing my Church of God roots and sort of Pentecostalism roots and everything. I did have this very bizarre experience because I had not had the chance to be back home in North Carolina for over 2 years. It's been about 2.5 years since I've been back, which is not a massive amount of time, but when you're accustomed to coming back about once a year, that was a long span. And one place that I was realizing I had not been back to in more than a decade was there's a town in the mountains called Whittier, and there's this campground that the Church of God is the denomination from which I come. That's my family. My mom and dad are still very much a part of it. And so we went to the campground where I spent
And to be clear, there's a Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee.
Yes, Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee. I'm told there are two, but
yeah.
So, but basically, we went to these campgrounds, and I knew we were going there. That was going to be because of some of the events that we had planned. They were sort of in the perimeter of that central area, so we were going to be going, and we were going to be staying on these campgrounds in some of their housing there. And I was unprepared because I knew it was happening, but it was one of those weird moments that if listeners or you, Nathan, have experienced this, then you'll know exactly what I mean when I say it. If you've never had an experience like this, then it might sound a little weird, but it was one of those things where I'm approaching, I knew it was happening, but as I'm approaching and I pull up into the driveway and I see the landscape for the first time, so many childhood memories come flooding back that I was unprepared, that I wasn't imagining in my head I would have. But suddenly all of these childhood memories come flooding back in. And the way I described it, I think I might have even thrown a Facebook post up there to describe it this way. The way I described it is, it's like my younger self came running around the corner, you know, like, and to meet me. And I was
Is it
just
similar height?
Yes, I have not grown much, as a matter of fact. It's, yeah, thank you for highlighting my shortcomings during my very personal nostalgic story. I appreciate that.
Sorry.
So
you're right here. It makes like the tactile nature of the humor, and the response time that much greater.
But sincerely, it was this very. I'm looking for a word that is better than nostalgic, because I'm trying to equate. It wasn't just this fond remembrance sort of thing. It was a very a present flood of, wow, standing in this place again. I did not know when or if I would ever stand in this space again, but I stood here many, many times as a child. And, you know, the summer camps, standing in this big sanctuary filled with chairs where we used to be there for revivals and camp meetings. And there was it was a very profound experience that I wasn't quite expecting. And it was... Yeah, it was something that it was near the very beginning of the trip, and that's what sort of launched the trip in. So it's been a time of reflection and sort of remembering my younger self and reflecting on the comparison between who I was and who I am and all of that sort of stuff. So anyway, I just, because you brought up the know, the Church of God roots.
Well, and interestingly, that is a reasonable segue into actually the movie conversation when we talk about, you know, religious experience and
right
versions of faith and Christianity and that sort of thing. So, Reed, we've kind of held off for a little while. I'm not sure I want to talk about this movie, but it's here.
Do you want to play a quick game of cards real quick, like on pod?
Sure.
And then maybe we'll run out of time, and then
Well, this will be the 2-hour episode, but it's really just us like Mario Karting, you know,
like
and riffing. Right. Oh, blue shell. So we are, in fact, today talking about Darren Aronofsky's 2017 Mother. Not his mother, his feature film Mother, starring Jennifer Lawrence. Yeah, that would actually. Maybe we should do that. Let's Google that real quick. Let's Wikipedia.
So mean to Darren Aronofsky.
Oh gosh.
Oh man.
Featuring Jennifer Lawrence and Javier Bardem, Ed Harris, Michelle Pfeiffer, and a ton of other folk. Randomly, Kristen Wiig included.
Donald Gleason.
That's right. That's right. Also known as General Hux. See, much like 2016, 17's Zack Snyder occasional riffing, but on the negative side, I'm going to be with The Last Jedi. It's just going to pepper it throughout the year in our conversations.
It's a new year.
Because I love it so much.
Yes.
And haters are going to hate.
Hate.
Yes, they are. Thank you, Taylor. So let's talk about Mother. I want to start... We'll get to the formula, trivial bits and whatnot if you have any. I don't. But I will tell you what I knew about this movie, and then I want you to inform as well, because what you know or don't know matters to your experience of the film.
Absolutely.
One, you and I talked about this. I want to alert listeners. It is rare. Like, I think about the movies we've covered before, and Reanimator comes to mind. I feel like there might have been one other one that really kind of pushed the envelope in terms of content. But there have been movies where I would say, hey, take caution when you watch. It's heavy.
Quick interjection.
Yes.
Like, we said that about films that we loved, like The Witch, or
sure, yes,
or even Bone Tomahawk for that one.
Yep.
Films that we wound up loving for a variety of reasons,
right,
but would exercise caution. And I would even say the same thing about The Exorcist. As much as I adore that film, that's like there should be an asterisk of warning before going into that movie. So.
And I would and to thank you for that clarification, to amplify that. For me personally, I at this moment in time, I do think we're on board for a rich conversation.
Sure.
There is a lot to talk about coming out of this film. I can't think of a movie I've sort of seen before that I would actively probably discourage viewers from watching. Mm-hmm. If you do watch it, there's a lot to talk about. I would be hesitant to say, go check this out. Even there are those who are listeners to our show that probably have already seen it and know some of what we're going to get into. But if you haven't seen this movie, it is sort of monstrously heavy. So big caution there, big parental advisory, more so than, horror or not, like it's rough.
Yeah. And Aronofsky tends to make those kind of films. I said about Requiem for a Dream specifically, but a lot of his films sort of have this nature to them where it's like you walk out and you're like, wow, that was a powerful film, very effective in a lot of ways, very successful in a lot of what it was attempting to do. I don't know if I will ever watch it again. Yeah. And Aronofsky kind of has a rhythm to that. He's made exactly one film that, even though it's right in line with all of the rest of the films that he's made in terms of theme and substance and structure, the one film of his that I have revisited now at this point probably 3 or 4 times was The Wrestler, the Mickey Rourke. That is a film that I really love. And
remarkably, somehow I missed The Wrestler. It made all the critics lists and whatnot when it came out. Really,
yeah.
I have seen Noah, Black Swan, and The Fountain, which I actually really liked. The Fountain a lot.
The Fountain is quite good too. Yeah.
Well, it's a very fascinating movie, and I enjoy both those performers very much. So the question I propped up a moment ago of what did you know? So for me personally, all I knew was it was very divisive. There was a scene a la like Bone Tomahawk, and that it I didn't read anything. I just remember seeing stuff percolating on the interwebs, something about some sort of statement the movie makes about God, which was to most folks negative. So those are really the only things I knew going in. So what did you?
What I knew beforehand, I'll go ahead and just say the only bits of information that I walked into the film with, because I actively avoided. There are a few of like our sibling podcasts that deal with film and faith that have covered Mother. I have actively not listened to those episodes. I will now, but
knowing we might get around to it, or
knowing we might get around to it, and that I had not seen it. So knowing we might get around to it, and that we had not seen it, I wanted to wait because I wanted I had already been spoiled on two major things, and those two things were, number one, I knew that it was a metaphor for the creation narrative. So I knew that going in. I was like, okay, metaphor for creation narrative. So then when certain characters start showing up, like for instance, huge spoilers for Mother already, guys. But so for instance, I knew when Ed Harris walked in the door, I was like, oh, that's Adam. Like I
sure.
First viewing, never seen the film, but I knew I'm following a creation narrative. I was like, okay, I wasn't quite sure yet who Jennifer Lawrence was supposed to represent. Kind of figured that out along the way, but I was like, okay, that guy showing up, that's Adam. Now that's Eve. Now that's clearly Cain and Abel. All of those types of things. The other piece of information that I knew is I knew that somewhere at the end, though I had no contextual information, I knew somewhere at the end a baby is violently destroyed, and I was like, oh. Okay, so like armed with those pieces of information, I wanted to know as little else as possible, I could have as fresh of an experience as I could going into it. So I kind of braced myself, battened down the hatches, and I was like, okay, because you had seen it already, and I knew that it had at least in a couple.
Well, and to frame that, I mean, so there's no confusion. I only saw it a week ago. I think you're saying like, yeah.
This is the first. I think this is this is the first film that we actively decided to talk about before neither of us had seen it. So it had been enough in the, we knew we were covering films of 2017, and I was like, well, if we're covering films of 2017, for our frame of conversation, Mother has to be on the list, because I knew it dealt with biblical metaphor. I knew it was a horror film, so I was like, we neither of us had seen it, but we had to cover it. So then you saw it actually before I did, and I knew before my viewing that it had, at least in those couple of moments, had a big impact on you in the sense of sort of emotional devastation, if I can use that word.
Yeah.
And so I was braced, and the hatches were battened down, and my viewing of it was definitely more, I'll call it cerebral, more sort of intellectual, because I feel like I had braced up so much mental and emotional buffers. But which maybe some listeners might hear that and be like, well, you didn't experience the film then, because you had already sort of safeguarded yourself. That's a conversation for another time.
I would almost say this one is worth the
it's
buffers.
Worth doing that.
I know of at least a few listeners who have not and probably will not watch this. For those of you who do heed the caution, Reed already loosely described the events of the film, but in sort of synopsis form, I can talk about it from my viewing experience, not knowing what was going on initially, not knowing this was meant to be a hard metaphor. You're presented with this very kind of abstract initial minute of film of how Jennifer Lawrence's character enters the story. From my personal viewing, I didn't know, is this I knew it was probably intentional, but I didn't know, was this just meant to be some sort of abstraction that we're getting into. So the first 20 minutes or so is she and Bardem interacting. Ed Harris shows up. Michelle Pfeiffer eventually shows up. What presented itself, and honestly, not knowing the metaphor initially, I just wasn't thinking about it. So I wasn't in that frame of mind. I'm approaching it in a very naturalistic kind of way. Okay, sure. Despite this rather abstract opening, these are just people in a scenario. Ed Harris shows up. He's sickly. And to the point that I didn't feel dumb about this, but it did after it clicked in. You see, there's a moment where you see Ed Harris's back, and he's got this slice, which is ultimately the rib of Adam and that sort of thing. Yeah. But in the moment, it just didn't click with me. I was like, gotcha. I was more, I was the viewer who was like, clearly that's a mystery. Are we going to learn about that? Well, once who are meant to be the Cain and Abel characters show up, it all kind of clicked into place. I was like, okay, I sort of see what we're dealing with now. And I would almost expound upon what you described in terms of creation narrative, although we may get into this more in theme. to me, it's far more than just the creation narrative.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the structural sort of counterpoint. Like, I don't have the language in pocket to be able to really describe this, but it's basically like he mirrored the framework of the creation narrative, at least for the first, half of the film. And then there's a section after the first half of about 15 minutes where he kind of gets into the flood. And then from there, it gives...
What would you describe as the flood?
Sink breaks, water flushes in, it causes everybody to leave. So... Interesting.
Okay. Yeah. That's funny, because I have on my... like right now on my notes, it says the sink that keeps coming up. And I was at a loss for... exactly what that was meant to be.
Oh, okay, yeah. So that was the first place my mind went. Again, tracking with this sort of, he's starting with this biblical metaphor. So then when the sink bursts and the water comes flooding out, and then you have this image, actually, I think a pretty effective, the movie, as much as we're kind of softly discouraging viewers from watching it, the film has some very interesting things that take place. Obviously, ripe for conversation. But when the flood happens, as they're walking out, Adam, which in the film he's just called man, and Eve is just called woman.
Sure.
The Javier Bardem character, who is meant to be a metaphor for God, that's called him with a capital H, which is why the film itself is called Mother with a lowercase m. All the rest of the characters are lowercase characters, and Javier Bardem's character, him, has a capital H. But when man is leaving, he leans over to him. Ed Harris leans over to Javier Bardem and says, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And then Eve's character, Michelle Pfeiffer, walks out and looks and gives this, like, just real angry, sort of spiteful stare at Jennifer Lawrence's character as they're all ushered out. But yeah, when the sink breaks, water floods into the house, and that's kind of what connected. The water floods into the house and everybody leaves. I was like, oh, that's meant to be.
Sure.
I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that.
Well,
but
I had not thought about that, because for me, at that point, I think that's probably accurate, because I mean, scripturally, the flood is an extinction event. It all the peoples of the world are diminished in the film.
Yeah.
When that happens, the house, empties.
Right. And then there's that's when we get into it's like immediately following that he impregnates her, and we have the baby narrative of the second half of the film begins.
Sure.
But casting that aside.
Well, I don't know. I'm sorry to cut you off there. I don't know exactly where you're going. This may be we will always now, or I will at least refer to the take shelter formula of we're just kind of going to go where the conversation leads.
Talk about it, right?
You made a reference a minute ago to some certainty about specifically the identity of Mother, and that's sort of on. It's not on my list, but it to you. Is it meant to be a literal sort of thing? Is she the essence of maternity? Is she Mary specifically? I would struggle with that a little bit.
I definitely don't think it's Mary.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, to you, it's Mary.
Well, in other words, a minute ago you said figuring out who that was. Like, how would you describe what your interpretation of her is?
Well, I sort of walked out of the film thinking this is Mother Nature, because it's I guess just because that phrase Mother Nature is so like locked into my brain.
Sure.
I was like, okay, I think that's the most natural place that it would go.
Right.
Plus, like, I picked up on, I did very little reading.
Sure.
Like, I don't have
Yeah,
like trivial bits
and
stuff like that because I've done very little reading. I wanted, and this is an exercise, maybe I won't do a good job, maybe I'm dumber than I think I am, but I wanted very much to see, like, okay, I've got this very little bit of external knowledge, meta knowledge. Let me see how much I can parse out just watching the film. And so I think she's meant to be Mother Nature because the house is very much like, if we're thinking of it in terms of, okay, Ed Harris is Adam and Eve and Michelle Pfeiffer is Eve and everything, they're very much coming into the house. So I'm kind of seeing the house as either A, Eden, or just the world.
Right.
And so that's why it's like, okay, if this is her house,
right,
and the house is seen as like the created world.
I can see that.
That's where I kind of went with. It's like, okay, so she must be like Mother Nature. And then it really, when I landed on that and said, like, I think that's what this is how much abuse she takes in the last half of the film. I'm like, I think, just knowing what little I know about Aronofsky, I think that would be something that he would probably try to infuse in there. Is like, we're really in a literal, the film is a metaphor, but taking that metaphor out of the realm, I think he's literally saying we are beating Mother Nature to death. Like,
my only hesitation committing to that, so a couple thoughts on what you just said. So Eden versus the world, to me, Eden is very directly represented by his office. Where the tree is, they're not allowed to touch the tree. He boards up the office. Right. He banishes them from the office. So to me, the house is more kind of the world. It's this microcosmic sort of view. I like your Mother Nature approach there. And this is what's challenging. I'm going to state this and put a pin in it. The strictness of the metaphor, how hard he steers into the metaphor, to me, lost me in a decent amount as a viewer. But I'll come back to that. So until you presented that Mother Nature idea, which I think has validity, to me it was like, is she spirit? Perhaps the Holy Spirit. This sort of Trinitarian idea. She is who births this baby, and that's to me where the Mother Nature metaphor or analogy would break down a little bit. Is what Mother the movie feels like is Darren Aronofsky's indictment of Christianity, and so I think it's far more literal of a scriptural approach, at least his understanding and interpretation of. Sure. Thus, her birthing is Mother Nature feels to non-Christian. Oh, does that make sense at all?
It does. Yeah, it does.
I think I like your interpretation, but the fact that she is an active birther of this baby, right? I don't know. I don't know how that would sync up with who is by definition of where the film goes meant to be a Christ child.
I think
figure.
So. Yeah. Including, and I won't say this very graphically right now, but including the baby's ultimate fate could be seen as I'm going to use the word perverted. I don't know necessarily that it's meant to be perverted in Aronofsky's sense. I just don't know him well enough. Don't know him at all. Never shook his hand. Never had a conversation with him. But but like a sort of perverted communion. Like,
I think it's exactly what it is.
Yeah, that there's this sort of it's that. And I wrestled a lot with her baby. Like, of course I saw Christ analogy in it. Of course I saw the communion analogy in it. But I'm sitting here and I'm like, but wait a second. Like, what is this trying to say about? Because, and of course, what I know, meta knowledge about it is I know Aronofsky's not a believer. I believe he's an atheist, but I know he's not a believer.
That would feel like not too much a stretch.
Right. I know for certain he's not a believer. I also think he, like, not even just an agnostic, not sure thing. Like, I think he believes there is no God. But I just couldn't understand quite, like, if you're going for the Christ metaphor, it's weird to me, but again, I'm a Christian. It's weird to me to take the Christ metaphor to death and communion and not try to infuse some sort of like resurrection, even if it's a falsehood or something. But again, I'm a Christian, so that's that's what I bring to it, of like, oh, why did you include this and not this other thing? But again, Aronofsky's trying to make the point that he's making, and that's not the point that I would make.
And I would, if it's okay, say let's hold, because I feel like where you're angling in that whole scene is the bulk of the thematic
sure
tell. And so if we can, let's hold there for just a second, if only because then we'll be on, it will feel moot to almost address anything else if
that makes sense.
If we fully unpack that.
Sure.
Here's a random question. Well, it's funny. I'm glancing at my notes and like what I wrote before I knew the metaphor real concretely. I wrote, this movie is so weird with like 3 E's. You know, I was like, I am having early in it. I was like, what on earth are we doing here?
Right.
So 2 thoughts. One, interestingly, your identification of these character names makes this question speak even more to me. So him is Bardem with a capital H, man and woman, all lowercase, mother lowercase. The title of the movie has an exclamation point. Like, do you have you thought about that? Do you have any interpretation of that? Like, that feels purposeful and intentional.
I think it would. I mean, I don't know if what he's going for is the idea of a child screaming for their mother, or if it would be like the empowerment of a mother. The decision she makes at the end of the film, is that what that's a reference to? Like sort of a giving back power, you know, the exclamation point very definitively, like a giving back power to this character that doesn't even have a capital letter at the top of their name. Like it's weird because it's a weird title in that the lowercase letter is intentional and the exclamation point is intentional.
Right.
So I'm like, he's telling us something, at least about what he thinks or about what he's scratching at with this film. Now, what that is, I don't know. So again, I'm going to feel real dumb if I postulate a bunch of ideas and then afterwards I plan to do research and I plan to listen to things. So if in like
we
2
can check
months,
back in. Sincerely, I mean, like I have not done reading or listening regarding interpretations of the movie because, like you, I wanted to come in. It is rich.
Sure.
But here's that question about the exclamation point. I have a hypothesis. So the struggle I had with this movie in a very real way is the struggle. This is going to seem like a random line to draw here. Is the struggle I have with the facing the giants of the world is, and there's going to be a happy medium. This is going to be a random aside here, but The Last Jedi. I sent to you the Film Crit Hulk piece. Anyone should go read that if you haven't yet, that he did on The Last Jedi. And he has this wonderful paragraph where he talks about Spielberg as a filmmaker. And he says there's this moment for many film watchers, and as they sort of mature, where they decide they don't like Spielberg because they realize, okay, you're just trying to get me to feel a thing. And the point Film Crit Hulk is trying to make is, yes. The art of storytelling is, I'm trying to make you feel a thing.
Yes.
Those who do it well can hide the strings very well, but still get you there. The problem I have with the things like the Facing the Giants is you're not even trying to hide the strings.
Yeah.
On the flip side, on the opposite end of the spectrum,
hold your thought. That's what we would term, or what I would term as manipulation.
Yes.
It feels like manipulation.
Yes. A big problem I have with Mother is you are not even trying to hide the strings here. You are very strongly, forcefully imposing what feels like, again, I, like you, have never shaken Aronofsky's hand. It feels like a very forceful point of view being foisted on me. And that point of view, in my interpretation of this movie, is antagonistic. It is, and this is where I'm going in the question about the exclamation point. The exclamation point almost feels like an FU, like a sarcasm, an irony, a lighthearted look, you fools.
Right.
This is what you believe in. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah.
I'm not stating that. That's what it feels like. That's as I sort of figure out, like, there's intentionality all over this thing. So there's that, and then there's the strictness of the metaphor. Because when the strings aren't hidden whatsoever, when, like Saeed on a beach, you find a giant electric, wire, and you're like, what on earth? They're all over the beach. You like that?
Yes.
But they're all over the beach and they're exposed. I don't trust you. I see what you're trying to do. The metaphor is so strong and so forceful, it took me out.
Okay.
Once it crystallized for me, and not knowing the metaphor coming in.
Okay,
But
sure.
once it crystallized, once I said, "Oh, the heart or the gem in the office
Sure.
is the tree.
Yeah.
The office is the garden. That's Adam. That's Eve. There's Cain. There's Abel." Suddenly, I was like, "I know where you're going, and I'm worried."
Okay, sure.
Which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
so. Reed alluded to this very strongly. To clarify very clearly, I'm going to unpack what this final scene is. Well, in the final scene. So clearly it's called Mother. There is some sort of mothering, some sort of maternity thing happening. Yep.
Pause and again hold your thought. I would call it, just for clarification's sake, I would call it the climactic scene, not the, because there are two very important things that immediately follow it.
Sure.
But yeah, the climactic scene. The scene, if we were putting exclamation points around it.
So in the film, as Reed mentioned a minute ago, Hem impregnates Mother, and thus the New Testament gets written. It's very on the nose, to me, troublingly so. You mentioned emotional devastation. So my personal response to this movie is, even though at about the midpoint, once the metaphor crystallized, I sort of knew where, in a general sense, all this was heading. And even unplugged, not actively, but became kind of inured. I was like, oh, once all the chaos is happening towards the end, I was not plugged in at all. I was watching events.
Yeah.
I was watching you force feed me.
Yeah.
Aronofsky, not Reed.
Right.
She delivers this baby. Bardem is as him, loves the adoration the people pour upon him. This house that is the world is filled to the brim with people who are chaotic and crazy. Oh man, I'm about to make a really lovely connection point here. So there's this moment that is devastating and heartbreaking before the most tragic moment. She has birthed this baby. She is nursing this baby. She, the character Mother, has been present for all of this chaos, is very much holding on to this baby, is trying not to fall asleep, while Bardem's Hem wants to show the baby to the people. Because Bardem, as him, loves the adoration, and he wants to show off this baby. And this is why I don't... And this is what's hard, and this can lead to possibly a conversation about artistry and the stories we choose to tell and the way we infuse ourselves and our perspective into those stories. But Aronofsky has a very defined view of God, or at least what he would say we as Christians articulate as God. Mm-hmm. It is self-serving. It is, perhaps revels in despair of the people.
It's a little needy. I don't know if this is what you, but like,
I wouldn't have quite said needy, but again, we're working with metaphor here,
sure,
and so
right.
all our words are attempts at explanation. So to attempt once more to wrap up this scene, she's trying to keep the baby. She dozes off, and you see multiple attempts on her part to not doze off because he's staring at her. And one of the most, like, if I can, and it's near impossible, if I can separate my sort of personal faith and belief system from the observing of this movie, it is great on a technical level. Sure. The performances are strong.
Yeah.
I am impressed with how more or less well the metaphor works.
Yeah.
It's not going to work 100%, but their, as performers' commitment to the metaphor.
Absolutely.
That scene in this moment when Jennifer Lawrence is trying to stay awake, nursing this baby, Bardem is staring her down, and there's multiple shots back to him of unmoving, unblinking, just staring, waiting.
Right.
And she falls asleep, and he perhaps the next moment there's a cut, and she comes to, and she wakes up, and she's no longer holding the baby, and she sees Bardem from the back walking out of this room, and she starts chasing him down. She turns him around rather dramatically, and he is no longer holding the baby. It is now being held aloft by, think of crowd surfing at a concert, by this throng of people. And in what can only be, perhaps for me personally, one of the top 3, if not top 2, if not top most devastating scenes in a movie I've ever seen, while holding this baby, jostling it about to and fro, you hear an audible neck snap, and it is devastating. And never have I been so unplugged from a movie emotionally, and then so, like a tidal wave sweeping over me, thrown back into the most deep emotional whatever I can feel. Right. Just to be frank with you, Reed, since we're just here by ourselves, instant weeping, like, oh my God. And then that moment is immediately followed by her chasing after through this crowd, pushing through the crowd. And it is extremely graphic and disturbing and troubling. You mentioned this a minute ago, and my whole point here is to just try to help listeners understand, if they haven't watched this movie, what we are talking about, because it is wrenching. She finds this altar throughout the film. Groups of people have been segmented off, a la denominations, a la factions, a la sects of Christianity. And on one of these altars, amongst these group of people, is entrails, bodily entrails, which are meant to be this baby. She looks around, and there are, tens of dozens of folks bloodily consuming bits and pieces of it. I mean, it is horrific. Of the highest order.
It's deeply, deeply disturbing. Even, no matter what your emotional connection to the film at that moment is, it is troubling and unsettling, and is intended to be. That moment is intended
sure.
to be.
Well, yes, but and this is the struggle in terms of my ability to be frank, trust the artist now.
Okay, sure.
Is, yes, it is intended to be devastating, but what feels even more so is it's intended to once more say, look, you fools, look at what you believe in. Isn't this horrific and awful and terrible? Why on earth would you think this is acceptable to believe in?
Right.
I do want to piggyback around to a minute ago. I had this really wonderful moment of inspiration, and why I would struggle with a mother versus where I'm going with this. Envisioning Bardem carrying this baby, envisioning a moment of a baby in a movie and an apocalyptic people's response to it. I couldn't help but think of Children of Men, which is glorious and beautiful.
I love that movie so much.
And perhaps holy. And is the complete counterpoint to that moment. Not necessarily where Mother goes in terms of entrail eating, but in terms of baby and response. Mm-hmm. If you haven't seen Children of Men, do check it out. I wholeheartedly endorse and encourage that. And there's a moment where this civilization that is babyless comes upon a baby through circumstances of the film, and they are all in awe. And it's beautiful, and just...
They lay down their weapons.
Oh, my God. I love this movie so much.
And the crowd's part to make...
I sort of wish it was horror so that we could talk about it in depth. So pivoting back to Mother... there's stuff I feel like is worth engaging, but I feel like we're at the doorstep of themes.
Well, again, take shelter.
I know.
Let's just do it.
I just like talking to you and them, and there's like a throng of notes right here staring at me.
Well, as we've said with other films before, I can't remember at the moment precisely which ones, but as we've said with other films before, there are certain films where it's all theme. We could break down likes, dislikes, we could break down scares and everything, but the film is theme. And this one I definitely would categorize as that. There's nothing... No,
I'm with you there.
That this film, from the start... one of the things I like, because I've railed before about how I can't stand, and I can't remember if I've railed on it here or if I've railed on it on more than one lesson or something, but I cannot stand the relatively recent convention of a film beginning with a scene that is either in the last third or in the climax of the film, and then it'll say 3 months earlier or whatever. So it's the opening shot of the film is something that will happen again later in the movie, but it starts you so that it kind of tries to draw you in, and then it says, now let me show you how we got to that point.
Right.
I cannot stand that convention. I hate it. My apologies to anybody who kind of likes that, but that I feel like it's lazy. I feel like it's a lazy sort of attention grabber that I don't care for at all. I thought that Mother was doing that. The opening shot of the film is a face, a female face, engulfed in flames.
Right.
And when the film started, I was like, great, you might as well just say 4 years earlier.
Oh, right,
whatever. I was like, okay. But to the film's credit and to Aronofsky's credit, that is not what's happening. Like, that is a previous incarnation of this narrative.
Well, then
that we're seeing.
finish where the movie goes, and then we'll fully dive into themes.
Because following the scene that you described, Mother is so devastated, she begins to kill the people around. She picks up broken glass, she begins to kind of slash at them, and she begins to kind of rail back and try to kill them. They overpower her and beat the ever-loving fire out of her. They rip her clothes. It's
graphic and disturbing.
Yes, it's a very upsetting scene because you're talking about this is not as sort of inhuman as the baby's fate is, but I mean the camera does not cut away as this poor woman is just being beat to pieces, and then following that she escapes them. She sort of curses him, as it were. You never loved me, you only ever loved them, or it's all about you. I forget exactly the language that she uses. And then she goes down to the basement and takes a lighter that the Adam character originally brought into the house. And so she takes that lighter, and when she takes that lighter, she engulfs the house in flames.
Right.
And so then it cuts to her face engulfed in flames. But then immediately following that, Javier Bardem is carrying her charred body. She's still alive, but he's carrying her charred body. And then they have a conversation, and then she asks him, like, if there was any question mark about the metaphor up to that point, she asks him, who are you, or what are you? And he says, I am I, which is a very specific callback to the I am that I am.
Right.
So he says, I am I, and you were home. And then he, in a bizarre moment, he asks her if it's still there. We don't know what she's talking about, whatever. And then he, using his hands, like opens her middle.
Her chest cavity.
Yeah, opens her up and pulls out, which at first is kind of charred, but he breaks it all off. It's a similar crystal that we saw him...
Representative of her heart.
Yes, yes.
Right.
At the very beginning of the film, we saw that same crystal was what the Adam and Eve surrogates smashed and destroyed in the Garden of Eden room. Yeah. And so then he places that crystal back on its little pedestal back in the Garden of Eden room. The house comes back, like all of the charred remains comes back just as it did immediately following the fire face and him doing that at the very beginning. So it's like the very end of the film is the very beginning of the film again. And then just as we saw Jennifer Lawrence's character wake up, we see a different woman wake up and say the same exact thing. The movie begins and ends with the word baby, which I think would probably have some significance. But it begins and ends with the word baby. The implication being this is a cycle that happens over and over again. He creates the world, the world is reborn, and then it will just come to the same ends again, and it will end in fire, and it will do, all of that sort of stuff. That being the sort of the takeaway, the final sort of thought that we are meant to come away from this film. And so to the convention that I was railing against, I thought at first that they were just previewing the end of the movie. Right. But to Mother's credit, they're not doing that. They are very...
Sort of. But yeah. I know what you mean.
They're deliberately saying this is a cycle that happens over and over again. It happened before Jennifer Lawrence. It'll happen after Jennifer Lawrence, and that this is just...
And see, what's a struggle for me right now is, like, that is interesting, but I feel like he just so bludgeons his version, and perhaps the version we present as believers, Judeo-Christianity. I mean, like, the movie just takes an axe to it. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, just the pure kind of reset, sort of metaphor of cycle, life, death, rebirth kind of thing is an interesting sort of through line and could have some fascinating. What?
Let me. Listeners don't know that Nathan visibly saw me sort of formulating a thought. It's
a very weird motion he does. He does a little jig, and it's.
I know. Yeah.
I know you've got a new thought. So go ahead.
Yeah, I call it the squiggle. And so, so basically, here's my view. I was trying in thought preparation for this conversation. I was trying to parse out, what do I think? Like, let me put on my English, my college English minor brain and do my literary analysis.
Sure.
What do I think the author thinks of him? The character him.
Right.
What do I think Aronofsky thinks of him? And here's what I've landed on at the moment. I think Aronofsky considers the character of him, whether or not he considers him to be an evil being or whatever, he is unquestionably a being that is reactionary or I'll call him unintentional, because in the film, Bardem's
almost purely responsive.
Yes. Bardem's character is consistently doing something, and when asked, what are they doing? When Jennifer Lawrence's character is asked, what are the human doing? I don't know. Like, it really stuck out to me how many times his character says, I don't know, through the course of the film.
Right.
I don't know. So I would even say, like, perhaps an ignorant portrayal of this character. Like, he's not in the know. And so he's, I don't know. And then he even says to her at the end, he says, I need them to create. This is what I am. This is what I do. I need them to create.
Poet.
Yeah, he's a poet. So he is, I know you're going to go to The Last Jedi here, but he is, in Aronofsky's mind, again, I'm making a lot of suppositions. This is just an observer of the film,
right,
trying to parse out what I think is being said. In Aronofsky's mind, I think he sees the character of him as a force which can do nothing but what it does. It just does what it does. So what it does is abuses its own creation for the sake of its internal need for adoration and affection. That it abuses the preciousness or the goodness that it brings forth, because it needs to be praised, or it needs these things, these people, in order to keep its creative spark alive. And so if I'm anywhere in the ballpark of what Aronofsky thinks about God, there is a sympathy, not anywhere close to an agreement, but there is a sympathy I would place for people who observe Christians and read the text of the scriptures, and without proper context, or without continual good healthy conversation in healthy contexts, not just judgmental finger wagging, I would sympathize with people who walked away going, man, God just needs praise and adoration, and he doesn't care who he hurts along the way as long as he gets praise and adoration. I don't agree with that. There's no part of me that
I'm like staring into your soul, saying,
I know.
Let's love. So what listeners won't know, so a very meta side note here, Reed and I usually record multiple episodes at once. We're only going to be able to do one today, largely because we were both so antsy to talk about Mother that here we are, and both have lots of thoughts. So what's fascinating to me as I'm hearing you say this is there are whole swaths of, at the very least, American, if not broader Christianity, for whom God existing for the sake of his own glory is a very real and primary tenet of faith.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is exactly what this movie is. It is saying, hey, if God exists for his own glory, this is the sort of what that looks like.
Yeah. These are the casualties along the way and the abuse that happens, and yes.
Right. And so you are making me more sympathetic, which I don't like. Stop trying to engender compassion in me here. But towards the artist here, there is a way in which my takeaway from Mother feels like antagonism towards Christianity. There's also a takeaway of, I can't blame Darren Aronofsky for feeling like this is what the world of Christianity tells him is going on, and this is his observation. And hey, guys, you are maybe a little off your rockers. Go ahead.
I apologize for cutting you off. Can I make a comparison between two people who, for reasons only based on the art they create, that I'm going to compare two notes here?
Do it.
I'm going to compare Darren Aronofsky, may seem a little odd at first, to what I've seen from Seth Rogen. So you take a film like Sausage Party versus a film...
I don't want to take that film.
But
anyway,
you take a film like Sausage Party versus a film like Mother. And here is what I will say. The individual filmmakers may have whatever degree of opinions, perspectives. They may, be very firmly, convinced of this, that, or the other. But a film like Sausage Party feels very assured of what it's telling you. It feels very much like, hey, everything you believe is just BS, and this is really all it is. Like a film like that, which is another film I would actively discourage viewers from seeing, but a film like that is very much like giving that's a film that is indicting Christianity. My experience of Mother...
What's funny about Sausage Party is I wouldn't know it got there because I actually went to see it. Shout out Matt Murray. We left after 15 minutes. So I was like, all this is singing about sex and strong opinions about things you think you're more confident in and knowledgeable of than you are.
Yes, and past the vulgarity, yes, it lays all of that bare against.
And so once I thought
systems.
That's all this is, I just walked out.
Yeah. so that's that, and that's that tone. And consistently, I kind of feel that way about a lot of the stuff that Seth Rogen puts out. I felt that way about the few episodes I've seen of Preacher, which of course I read Preacher, and it's kind of that same note. But casting that aside, I do not, and maybe I'm in error, I do not get that same degree of assuredness from Aronofsky's work. So even in Mother, I do not feel indictment. I feel very much anger and frustration, and I feel very much from the film, I feel a sort of a burst of fury at whatever his perceptions are of this thing. But what I was surprised to not feel was what you're describing. I did not feel Aronofsky sitting in some superiority place saying, you all suck. I felt very much hey, your God is confused and your belief system is confused because look at the abuse. But that to me felt different from the alternative, in what I'm describing as what Seth Rogen puts out, which is like, hey, I know more than you stupid, ignorant people. I don't get that from Aronofsky. I get observations from Aronofsky that do sort of tangentially indict things, but I just don't get the sense from Mother that it is just fully like, you guys are just full of garbage. I feel like this is an exploration.
Right, and what's interesting to me about that, and that opens the door, thank you, rather explicitly towards what I feel like the movie leaves out, and whether it was intentional on his part or not, I don't know. But I referenced this early in Fear of God, the life of this podcast, the book A More Christ-Like God by the author Brad Jersak, which I adore and is a touchstone of my hopefully more mature and definitely adult version of faith. And what I came away from this movie, I am sympathetic, and I do, your language of fury and anger is interesting because a question I would have is, maybe perhaps a rhetorical question, is at what is that anger directed? Is it merely how we failed in presenting, God? But what's fascinating to me is the book A More Christ-Like God is literally about, as its title suggests, God is Jesus, and God is like Jesus. If you want to know what God is like, you look at Jesus.
Right.
And so what's fascinating to me about this movie is it has a Christ analog in it, but it is not Christ. And I don't mean that in a metaphysical way. I mean that in a literal way. You left out the heart. And for a movie about an existential metaphysical heart, you left it out because this movie is cold and it is...
Indeed.
It is lifeless, despite the title of Mother.
Right.
What arrested me, Reed, is in this movie, a baby is destroyed for an artist's perhaps false interpretation of what I would call orthodoxy, and a movie's poor understanding of to me, the Christ himself, which is the history of the world hinges on the birth of a baby. The redemption of all things hinges on the death of a man. And I don't mean a person with external genitals. I mean a grown, mature adult who willingly is not afraid of what is to come.
Right.
And that's a very different story.
No question.
And that's what really arrested me and I struggled with, because we should all lament the death of a child. We should all lament the death of any person.
Right.
But there is something very different about that presentation.
Right.
And that's why I struggle. I'm like, you have either not received, or you are definitely not portraying the whole story.
Right. Absolutely. Right.
And what I have in my notes is, if you take Jesus out of Scripture, what you have is the movie Mother.
I couldn't agree more.
And that is why I wrestled so, like, my wife, whom I talk about not in explicit detail most of these movies with, I haven't told her about what happens in this movie. I'm like, it's too heavy.
Right.
I don't even quite know how to deal with it. I'm not going to tell you about this. It's just too much.
Yeah.
Because it's not. Aronofsky, maybe this is a strong phrase, makes fun of what I would say, yeah, it's wrong. That's wrong.
Right. That's incorrect.
That is, and I lament, and I find great sorrow in how, this is what you and I talk about. Like, what is faith, and what is faith for the person who, at minimum, respects the person of Jesus, on the opposite end of that, loves and tries to adhere to his teaching.
Sure, of course.
And I think that's what's so troubling about this movie, is you start at point A, which is a God figure and Adam and Eve. And that's partly why I unplugged, because I didn't know Death of a Baby, but once it crystallized, I was like, I know where you're going. And I don't know that I'm going to trust how you do this. That's sort of what I'm trying to drive at, and what has undergirded a lot of my interpretation of this movie. Is it's like, because getting that right is landing the plane correctly and faithfully.
Of course.
Getting it wrong is an abomination.
Right. Yeah. Of course.
Of course.
And
I'm glancing at my notes real quick here.
Can I interject?
Yeah, please.
So I completed a book a while ago. I've now shared this book with you, and soon, hopefully, we will have the author on the show to talk about it. It's a book by J.R. Forasteros called Empathy for the Devil. And the premise of this book is taking the most notorious villains of the Bible and putting yourself in their shoes so you can kind of see things from their perspective. One of the troubles that I have, that I've had pretty consistently with people, is when they say, like, well, why is the God of the Old Testament so different from the God of the New Testament? I have never had a problem reconciling the two, because to me, what you just articulated about, you have to look at, I'm a Christian, so I look at the whole of Scripture through the lens of Jesus. And in my theological framework, like you said, Jesus is God. So Jesus is the lens through which we understand the heart of the Father. Like, apart from him, we don't understand it, which means apart from him, there are so many intentions or events in, like, say, the Old Testament that would make no sense, or would at the very least give a misrepresentation of the heart of the Father in those events. Right. So when you flip that around and you begin to look at the whole of Scriptures through the lens of the person of Jesus Christ, then it does take on a new flavor. The reason I brought up Empathy for the Devil is because Forasteros' main premise is, when you step into someone else's perspective and sort of consider the piece you're not missing, you generate compassion and you generate understanding. And yes, I would agree with you, if this is sort of in an oversimplified way, what you're saying is, looking at the God figure separated out from Christ.
Of the movie.
The God figure of the movie. Or in life.
Period, right.
Yeah. Separated out from the person of Christ, and you get an incomplete picture. And with an incomplete picture, frequently we'll get an incorrect picture, that this is not right. That the God you are describing or serving or living out is incomplete without the person of Jesus Christ. And so that is absolutely what is present in Mother. Like Mother, Javier Bardem is God, but Christ is nowhere
Absent.
in that film.
Right.
Even if Mother's Baby is meant to be a kind of surrogate for that happening or for that occurrence, and we already said I believe that's supposed to be kind of a perverted communion. That is not Christ. That's not an understanding of who he is. I love your articulation of, yes, it's the birth of a baby, but the death of a man who makes
Right.
that choice. Christ
Right,
said in the
right.
scriptures, nobody takes my life from me. I
Right.
lay it down.
Right.
Like I'm making this choice. And it is fascinating to me when we consider. I've had several conversations with family and over the past few days as we've spent time together, and I said one of the things that bothers me is I feel like we, as believers and as evangelists, if you want to call that proselytizers, we need to believe the gospel more. And what I mean by that is we are terrified of sin. And we are terrified of that, like the darkness is eventually going to be greater than the light. So what we tend to do is we tend to overcompensate, and we tend to present a father God, who is vindictive and very wrathful and who is filled with all kinds of, just waiting as the judge on a high hill to dole down lightning bolts. And I'm like, yeah, there are passages of scripture where that's absolutely the image that you walk away from. But when you look at what Christ did and who Christ was and how he walked through the world and what his whole intention and purpose was, that's the heart of the Father. The heart of the Father is redemption and restoration. That's the piece you were missing. And so naturally, okay, so I don't know when we'll need to wind this down, but can I briefly bring in the scripture that I had in mind, or do you have some other thoughts you want to unpack first?
A little bit. I'm baking on the inside, but I want to affirm what you're going to, and perhaps the scripture you'll bring in will just further turn the wheels. But for me, I can't recommend to those. You see, I keep calling listeners readers, and so I'm going to presume you are literate folk. Go read Brad Jerzak's A More Christ-Like God. It is fascinating that your soliloquy read a minute ago about the character of Bardem in this made me think of, just call it out, sort of Piper theology, Reformed theology. God exists only for the glorification of himself. Right. But it's so fascinating now. I'm not, because this is a devastating movie, but I'm almost intellectually saying, no, go watch this, because this is what that looks like. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. If you want a God who exists solely for the glory of himself, this is what that looks like. Right. Right. Let me give the people the thing so that they'll love me. Mm-hmm. And to draw that real clear point, God is Jesus. If we want to know God, we look at Jesus the man, and that's kind of the end of the story. What's fascinating to me is a word historically I might use in faith context, and hear me, we can nuance this all we want, is rebirth. I watch this movie and I don't think I'm a fan of that word anymore. And in fact, what I wrote down is, to me, bearing in mind there can be some nuance here, God is not a God of rebirth as such, but a word you used a minute ago, but of restoration. Mm-hmm. Existing things being made right, good, and whole.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Very much
so. I don't believe in the we are the great experiment that when we fail, it's just a reset and here we go again into the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Jesus says you must be born again. Sure. Mm-hmm. If we're going to nuance this some, let's talk about that. He doesn't literally mean go back into the birth canal and make that happen again. What he's referring to is a metaphorical on a certain level.
Well, that was Nicodemus'
become
question.
Like a child. Right.
That was Nicodemus' question. Is like, how can I, as a grown man, enter back into my mother's womb? And Jesus answers him by saying, that which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the spirit is spirit.
Sure.
So Jesus himself was Nicodemus' question, and Jesus is saying, that's not what I mean.
Yeah.
I mean another thing.
Yes, and I appreciate you using Jesus' words to validate what I'm saying, because that just makes it all awesome. But again, that point of I think why I feel this so passionately and urgently is this is what has been presented. Mm-hmm. This version of you're all just going to burn it down and love me while you can,
Right.
because I love that. But on your way out, I'll do it again. And I think, I really want to use really forceful language, but it can't be stated enough. Missing from the picture is the point of it all, and Jesus's way to the world and to people.
Right.
Yeah, I feel like I'm winding down. So yes, please.
So here's the scripture that I had in mind, and it's a lengthy passage, but I'll go through it briefly as I can. So 2 Peter chapter 3, beginning at verse 3, and I'm going to read through the 13th verse. I'll clip along as quickly as I can. Above all, you must understand that in the last days, scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, "Where is this coming he promised? Ever since our ancestor died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation." Pause quickly from the text of the scriptures. That's talking about the inevitable sort of everything's just happening the way it's happening. Verse 5, "But they deliberately forget that long ago by God's word, the heavens came into being, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly." So again, pausing the scriptures, that would seem to validate Aronofsky's cycle. Verse 8, "But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." Verse 10, "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar, the elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare." Verse 11 says, "Since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? You ought to live holy and godly lives as you look forward to the day of God and speed its coming. That day will bring about the destruction of the heavens by fire, and the elements will melt in the heat. But in keeping with his promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells." And my focal point, that's the lengthy passage, and the reason I wanted to bring that in is because, yes, Aronofsky has some touch points in Scripture to sort of base what he's articulating there, which is why it doesn't feel to me like the Rogan analogy of it's all crap.
Sure.
Like Aronofsky's clearly done at least some degree of intellectual research.
Right.
And, he's got at least a few coins in his pocket. But the point that it's missing is that idea of that is read in verse 9, that instead the Lord is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. That is a tremendous absence in Mother, is a God who is desirous and is leading people to try to come to understand a very intentional redemptive plan. A very intentional restorative plan that he wants to invite people into and wants to graft them into and make them a part of, not at the abuse and neglect of everything, but in this understanding of when we say we look for, a new heaven and a new earth, I think some people take that to mean, well, screw this one.
Right. Well, many people take that to mean this.
Well, forget that one. And I could see, let me just be fair.
Hashtag recycle.
I could see, to be fair, some readers reading a passage like that and saying like, well, that's what that's saying, and saying this is all going to go away, so who cares?
But take your Nicodemus just a minute ago.
Right. Yes. That it's an idea of when we say these things, we think of them in linear context.
Right.
Well, this has already come, so this next thing has to come after it. And it's like, no, we are looking for something that, because Jesus also said countless times, the kingdom of heaven is at hand.
Right.
You're not going to look off and see it like, oh, there it comes, or here it is, because the kingdom of heaven is within you. And so there is this dichotomy of, no, it's not just about going back to the womb. It's not just about going up, but that which is born of the flesh is flesh. And yes, the flesh is perishable and will perish.
Right.
That which is born of the spirit is spirit and will not.
Right.
And that's the important, again, that's the important absence from the story of Mother. I do think that we ourselves, we abuse I will say in this context, I think Aronofsky's onto something.
Sure.
We abuse the good things God has given us.
Right.
We violate it, we destroy it, we consume it, we abuse it.
Right.
What I think is, again, that I'll hit very hard, what I think is missing from Aronofsky's film is God's ultimate intention amidst
Right.
all of those things that are
Because that's
happening.
what's fascinating about you drawing that clear line there is, to my recollection, the opening scene to the final shot does not seem to be with purpose, and he
No.
does not declare it as such. You know what I mean? It's just,
Yeah.
well, happened again.
He says in the film, the Javier Bardem's character says, "This is what I do.
Sure.
This is, I create. So
Right,
this
right,
is what I
right.
do." So it just
And-
and it basically has no choice in
Right,
the matter.
right,
And
right.
and one thing that I deeply believe about God, again, we're getting to this idea of intention. God
Sure.
is very purposeful. Christ himself laid down his life intentionally, like I'm doing
Right,
this,
right.
And so the intentionality of God is something that I, as a believer, think is utmost of the essence
Sure.
to understand. I
Right.
believe there's intention in his action. I believe there's intention in his silence or his inaction. That's a whole other conversation. But I believe my theological framework is in a very intentional God, not
Right.
a reactionary God, which, yes, many passages of the scripture taken in a bubble, yes, God looks reactionary. I will give you that, non-believers. I will give you that, people who, with some sort of complicated theology, taken in a bubble, many of the passages of Scripture, God looks reactionary. He looks reactionary at the Tower of Babel. He looks reactionary at the flood. He looks reactionary in the Garden of Eden when he walks in and is like, "Who told you were naked?"
Right,
Like,
right.
That looks reactionary.
Sure.
And so if that's what Aronofsky's looking at, I sympathize with him.
Right.
But I would want so badly, like Paul did to the people in Athens, I would want so badly to come and say, "Here's the piece you're missing. Here's the component that you maybe haven't encountered or hasn't been presented to you in a way like Brad Jersak would of a more Christ-like God. This is
Right,
the
right,
element
right.
in your narrative that will shape and reframe it."
Right.
As it did. We've talked before on this pod about how we lose sight of just how revolutionary Christ's presence in the world was. Changed everything.
Right,
Literally
right,
changed
right.
everything. But we lose sight of that. And we lose sight of the before and after, that is the crux of time. That is the crux of
Sure.
everything, was his entry into the world. And
Well, I think you're this language of intention, and we can start to wind towards a close if that's possible with this unwieldy of a number of topics here. That language of intention is so valuable because, to me, apologies to those who would ascribe to a more strict version of this, to me the intention of God is not glorifying himself. To me the intention of God is that those who have wandered and those who don't realize they have are welcomed home, restored, whole, at a table that will not be extinguished.
Sure,
and
of course.
and known and loved. That is the intention of God.
yes, absolutely.
And that intention is expressed through the man Jesus, his life, teaching, death, and resurrection. Even.
Sure, of course.
And on that subject of, to pivot a bit on that subject of rebirth and perhaps reframing that sort of language as I don't know if you read this apocryphal text, although I know you're familiar with it, as brothers Lindelof and Hughes say, and is it Beyond the Sea? I don't think it's Beyond the Sea, that it only ends once.
Across the Sea, yes.
Right. It only ends once. Everything before that is just progress. So it only ends once, brothers and sisters. Everything before that is just progress. Woo! Mm-hmm. Mother. I should have called this one Uncle. Call Uncle. Say Uncle when you're done. Uncle, Mommy, I'm done.
Oh, man.
Jeez
And,
Louise.
I mean, there's obviously a mountain of things that could be said. This is a kind of film that invites conversation. I think you said it very, very well when you and I were talking off mic, pre-mic, whatever you want to call it. You said it very well where you said, I would actively discourage you from seeing it. But if you've seen it, let's talk about it.
Right.
And so I think we would say that to each and every listener of this piece, while the reason for the discouragement is because it's heavy and we feel like it's misguided in a few of its presentations of the character of God. But there's a lot we're talking about.
It is graphic.
And it's
I mean,
very
the
graphic.
scene we did unpack, it is graphic
Very
and extremely disturbing.
Not only the baby, but what they do to Jennifer Lawrence's character as well.
Sure.
It's very, very disturbing stuff. But that having been said, let's bring a little bit of our
lighten the mood.
Yeah, let's bring a little bit of our
Let's
uncle.
leaven the bread.
Yeah, our uncle, David S. Pumpkins, and because he's family now. He's been around for a while. He's family.
Hopefully, not that uncle.
So yeah, let's bring in our good friend David S. Pumpkins. Let me just pull up my little measurement. As we do with every film, we rate it by a measurement of style, scares, and substance. Mother may be a little bit difficult to sort of assess those kind of things, but
I don't think so.
But in the area of style, what would you give to?
I usually define style in a way of liking a thing. I would give it a 1.
Oh wow! Okay.
Which again, as you just described, feels like a slight. It's more just I did not like watching it.
Sure,
I did not
sure.
enjoy the watching of it.
I understand.
So from that standpoint, I would rank it low.
I'm going to briefly assess this. Given what I've seen of Aronofsky, I was kind of expecting more flourish. Like I was expecting it to look more interesting.
It's a very direct line.
But it is very direct. I do, because of my sympathies towards him and how well I think the metaphor works for a narrative, even though we've obviously unpacked what I disagree with on other things. I'm going to land at a 3. So for me, style is about a 3. I think there's some really good stuff there, but I think there's some very important stuff missing. So yeah, 3 for me. In the area of scares, I'll go first. I'm gonna, because it's difficult for me to articulate like scares versus nightmare, like in the nightmare sense versus like disturbing and unsettling. I'm gonna give scares a 4.5. It's a pretty harrowing kind of film in that regard, and I think very frightening and disturbing and unsettling in a lot of ways. So I'm gonna land at a 4.5.
For me personally, scares, it's a 5, just no question. I mean, it is disturbing, it's distressing. And even on a meta level, it's harrowing from the standpoint of how wrong we've gotten it in terms of presenting a cogent message of love and faith.
Yeah, very, very effective in that regard. Substance is so difficult for me because with Substance, I struggle because if you want to talk about how much there is to talk about,
right,
probably a 5. If you want to talk about how much I think is missing from the picture it's trying to scratch at, there's a much lower number.
Sure.
So for Substance, I'm gonna lean gracious, and I'm gonna give it a 4 for Substance for me, because I do think there's important key things missing from the substance of what it's scratching at.
Right.
But I do think there's, again, if you've seen it, I want to talk about it with you.
Right.
So yeah, 4 for me.
Yeah, I mean, my impulse would have been 5, but I think you can't ignore. I can't. It'd be one thing if it was naturalistic that flirted with metaphor.
Sure.
It is metaphor, just period, beginning to end.
It's all the 2 hours is.
And that metaphor, in my interpretation of the movie, is very directly Judeo-Christian sort of faith, and from that standpoint, like you're saying, I can't ignore what you're leaving out.
Yeah, of course.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think it is so strong in clearly conversation. I would still probably lean towards a 4 like you, but
okay,
that one point is very representative.
Yeah, of course. And that lands us, rather surprisingly, I thought we might give this a little lower, but that lands us, because of its scare and its substance measures, that lands us at a 7 out of 10, David S. Pumpkins. And I think, again, that, this is where our somewhat fun measurement of David S. Pumpkins sometimes fails us. Sometimes better films get a lower number because they're not very scary or they're not very substantial or whatever. And then films like this, which we would say, watch at your own risk, is,
with an exclamation point at the end of that sentence.
Watch at your own risk. But so for the sake of time and you know what, we've done it 3 times now. This is probably just going to be the pattern. So stay tuned during our closing music for the stock social media cues. That the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. It is not at all the end of the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned to hear how you can get in touch with us in a variety of ways. Nathan, it's good to see you again. Good to be in the same room.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, for probably a while. The rest of the stuff is probably going to be across the country. But but thank you very much for taking the time and for having this conversation with me about mother,
mommy.
All right, guys.
See you next time.
Have a happy New Year. We'll see you next time. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but not the end of the conversation. To continue this conversation, you can follow us on Twitter at The Fear of God. You can visit us on Facebook to comment on one of our posts or post there yourself. You can follow Reed on Twitter at Reed Lackey. You can follow Nathan on Twitter at The Nathan Rouse. Visit morethanonelesson.com to leave a comment on this post or any of the other official episode posts. Email us, fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com, all one word, fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. And last but not least, if you listen to us through iTunes, we would greatly appreciate a rating or review. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.